It's 1961, Houston, Texas, a cold night. In a sketchy part of town, police are called out to a reported fire burning in a ditch by a local business parking lot. After extinguishing the flames, a body is discovered among the ashes, and the man is thought to have been burned to death. Yet, upon a closer look, police realize it wasn't the smoke or flames that killed him, but several rounds from a handgun pumped into his torso. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of close to 50 books. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line.
I feel wonderful. I just thank God that I can really have another chance at life now.
Do you plan any changes in your life?
I want to become a beautician, what I had started before, and get married and have a family.
What observations are you able to make about your experiences over the past 3 years? How do you feel about them?
That is an experience that nobody could ever put into words. It was just like walking down a hall with no exit. My lawyer, Clyde Woody, has just performed a miracle.
That woman whose voice you just heard in that 1964 interview sounds relieved, even joyful maybe, but definitely grateful, I think we can all agree. Which might seem strange, seeing that the interview was conducted in the immediate moments after she is convicted of murder and sentenced to 5 years in prison. 3 years before that same interview, after her first trial, that same woman was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. But just 4 hours before she and her co-defendant were set to be strapped to the electric chair, a federal judge stepped in and stayed both executions.
Mr. Woody, you speculated a while ago that this 5-year sentence could be very short. Could you explain that for us now?
Yes, the court has the prerogative, if he wants to give her the credit for the 3 years that she has spent in jail. I'm going to ask him to do that.
With good credit or good time for credit for good time, this could be cut down considerably. Is that right?
Yes, to about 10 months.
The elation in her voice is twofold. Not only will she live, but as you heard her lawyer explain, there's a good chance she'll serve only about 10 additional months out of those 5 years for murder. Her name is Carolyn Lima. She sports black hair, short and curly, and, as you heard, has a bit of a Western twang in her voice. More than anything, however, Carolyn expresses the humility of a woman who did what she had to do to survive during what was, no doubt, one of the worst moments of her life. Carolyn's case begins in 1961 on a rather chilly night in downtown Houston, Texas. Houston police are called out to a vacant lot in what is a sketchy part of town on February 6th. It's late into the evening. The caller explains that a fire in a ditch near a local business parking lot is gathering momentum and quickly getting out of control. The grassy area in the ditch is dry and burning, and someone needs to put it out before the fire spreads to local homes and businesses. Fire personnel soon arrive and extinguish the flames. Before, that is, discovering the nude body of a middle-aged man underneath the ashes and debris further down into the ditch. Within the available evidence at the scene, it's pretty clear that the guy did not light himself on fire, so his body is sent to the medical examiner's office for an immediate autopsy. The coroner quickly determines that gasoline had been poured over the dude, but he wasn't lit on fire and burned to death. They also find 6 .22 caliber rounds and extract them from his body. He's been shot to death. The fire turns out to be a ruse. So his death is ruled a homicide, and the investigation begins. I gotta be honest here. This is quite the true crime story, like perhaps none you have ever heard. Vital to understanding the case is the fact that Houston, Texas, is not a place a gay woman or man in 1961 would feel safe living his or her life out in the open. Point in fact, being gay in many states at this time was, for the most part, a felony. Just 9 years prior, in 1952, the American Psychiatric Association had actually listed homosexuality as a form of mental illness. And President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed an executive order banning anyone found guilty of, quote, sexual perversion, being gay, in other words, from holding down a federal job. The term transgender would not be coined for another 4 years. So as we get into the dynamics of this complex case, it's important to note these social norms at the time, hard as it all might be to believe within the context of contemporary America. In the hours before the fire was reported, an employee working for the dead man, who has since been identified as a local real estate broker, Fred Tones, reports to Houston police that she saw and heard something earlier that night. It was near 5 p.m. when she spotted a Packard, which could mean any number of luxury vehicles made by automobile manufacturer Packard. Think of those big and bold-looking cars you might expect Humphrey Bogart to be driving around in a 1950s detective film. His arm out the window, wearing a slick fedora, and a filterless cigarette dangling from his mouth. As the witness further reports, 2 women got out of the Packard she saw in the lot not far from where the fire burned. They proceeded to enter Fred Tones' office. The office is part of a duplex, the witness being on the opposite side wall between her place and Fred's office. I heard some noise and scuffling around next door, which sounded like a fight, she says, and then what sounded like a shot. This made sense to investigators. As it were, they had discovered blood in the entranceway to Fred's office. After searching further, they found blood inside the office as well. Fred's portable television is the only item missing from inside the office. Outside, his Lincoln Continental is gone. So a robbery gone bad by 2 women who arrived in a big old Packard sedan and left in the victim's Lincoln. As investigators spread out and begin talking to others in the area, they discover Fred's clothes have been found in several different garbage bins. And a Packard, fitting the description they have, without license plate tags, has been located at the nearby home of an elderly couple. Then someone comes forward to report that 2 women were seen firing a weapon into a ditch close to the office where the murder occurred. Upon recovering the slugs from the ditch, they matched the bullets taken out of Fred Tones' body. After hitting up a few local gun shops, they are told by one, 2 women bought a pistol 2 days before the murder, the same caliber matching that of the bullets used to murder Fred. Then they get a report that the Packard's license plate tags have been spotted on a Lincoln heading out of the city. So things appear to be coming together. A pair of women murdered Fred Tones, dragged his body out to the lot, poured gasoline on him, and set him on fire. And now they are in his vehicle heading out of town. It starts to almost sound like a Humphrey Bogart film. Over the course of the next few weeks, the car is tracked from Texas to New Orleans to Maryland. The women spent 1 night in New Orleans, a few in Maryland, before winding up in New York City. I'm surprised they didn't go to Florida. And then this, as investigators begin interviewing people close to the women, there seems to be a bit of confusion. It appears that in some instances, they are described as 2 women, in others, a woman and a man. and still others, a woman and a man dressed as a woman. Then finally, two names emerge. Carolyn Lima, who you heard at the beginning of the podcast speaking about her second conviction for murder, and Leslie Ashley. Leslie is an enigma in some ways, and also a man, a very outspoken member of the underground gay movement in Houston who often dresses as a female. In fact, Leslie is branded by some of the more tabloidish newspapers at the time as the, quote, Bible-quoting female impersonator. Leslie is in her late 20s, Carolyn late teens, and both are now wanted fugitives on the FBI's most wanted list. Leslie has a record, sex delinquency, which meant then any number of crimes associated with sexual offenses, including sodomy, along with an assault and battery charge. The affidavit for their arrest calls Carolyn and Leslie, quote, an admitted prostitute and admitted homosexual. So you can see how different things were back some 60 years ago and how terrified those in the gay community would have been just by simply coming out. You were humiliated, ridiculed, sometimes beaten up, and arrested. It appears that Carolyn and Leslie had been living together in a one-room, dingy, disgusting Houston apartment since 1960. Carolyn made her living in the sex trade, and it appears Leslie had pushed her to get into the game. The reason why investigators landed on them so quickly turned out to be that Carolyn had been meeting Fred Tones, the homicide victim, once a week for sexual encounters over the past year leading up to his murder. So people within the complex and surrounding area knew Carolyn by name and sight. Not a lot is known about Fred Tones, the victim. He appears to be a married father in his late 30s or early 40s, a local real estate broker who liked to drink and meet up with sex workers. Carolyn had become a favorite of his. There's one point during Carolyn's trial when Fred's wife basically lies about the time of his whereabouts that night, saying that Fred was with her at a local hotel near 6 p.m., which is about the time investigators believe the ladies arrived at Fred's. Part of this is embarrassment as to what Carolyn and Leslie had told investigators about Fred's sexual tastes and preferences. So his wife is trying to, per se, salvage the family reputation, protect the name. When Fred met Leslie for the first time, Leslie was dressed as a female. And when Leslie was in drag, she looked like a female. In one news story about Leslie many years after the ordeal that sent her and Carolyn to death row, she talks about growing up in Houston during the 50s as a gay man, how effeminate she was then, how she wore makeup and dressed up in women's clothes and didn't much care what people thought or said about her. But it wasn't without serious problems or backlash. Life was hell for me, she is quoted in that article. High school was worse. My life was so miserable, I was friendless and dropped out of school. She said she was raised in a Jewish household where homosexuality was unacceptable. Her grandmother was Mexican, and that side of the family shut her out completely. At a young age, Leslie was on her own, living on the streets, learning how to survive. Born and raised in Hot Springs, Arkansas, Leslie has reddish-brown hair, which she sometimes dyes black. She's about 5 feet 9 inches tall, 130 pounds, and she once worked as a photographic equipment salesperson. I was so much a female, she is quoted, that I took the role full-time and became a street prostitute. Leslie was arrested many times for solicitation and, get this, vagrancy, which dressing up as a female was considered. She was treated poorly by police and jail personnel and often put into random lineups and humiliated. I have to say the tabloids back then were far bolder and more explosive, debasing, exploitive, and crushing, if you can believe that. There was no compassion at all, no sense of empathy for sure. One tabloid article, written just after the ladies were arrested, opens like this. Texas prison officials wonder if lesbians and male homosexuals fry in the electric chair the same way as sexually normal murderers. That is beyond abusive, degrading, and depraved. But it was acceptable rhetoric at the time. Readers actually expected it. Leslie suffered from gay bashing by police and the general public, she later claimed. Beaten quite often simply for living her life as she wanted. So meeting Carolyn turned out to be a godsend. Carolyn never judged Leslie, never questioned her lifestyle or cared what others thought. So they hit it off and went into business together. When Fred saw Leslie that first time, he immediately offered both women a lot of money for what Leslie and Carolyn later referred to as a three-way, a tryst. Once a week, the three of them inside his office. Carolyn had once introduced Leslie as her brother, and Fred knew she was male. But he never said anything more than wanting a threesome with the two of them. So they assumed he was into that sort of thing and was willing to pay for it. A later appeal document put it this way, quote, Fred Tones suggested that Leslie be part of a perverted three-way act of sexual deviation, and they went to his office to engage in these acts with him. Sexual deviation. Even law enforcement reporting the basic facts of a case could not restrain its bias and animosity. So Leslie and Carolyn made a date and showed up at Fred's office on that February 6th night with the idea that they would first discuss a price and then engage in that threesome Fred Tones wanted. That encounter, however, would turn into an extremely violent fight among the three after Leslie and Carolyn found out the real reason Fred Tones had invited them to his office. I'll be right back after a short break.
This season on Very Scary People, Christine Belford reports her 3 young daughters missing. She has no idea where they are, but she knows who took them. Her ex-husband has teamed up with her former in-laws to do whatever it takes to have total control of the girls, including stalking, harassment, and even murder. Listen to Very Scary People wherever you get your podcasts.
That appeal document I mentioned earlier called the encounter among the three of them a sordid matter, which tells us a lot about the writer of the document, presumably a prosecutor. To add the word sordid changes the entire tone of the investigation and prosecution and what? Makes it personal. As Leslie and Carolyn stand inside Fred's office and he starts talking about what he wants to do, Fred pulls out a freaking bayonet, one of those long-bladed knives you'd see on the end of a Civil War rifle. So here they are, ready to service the dude, and he brandishes a sword. Holding up the sword, the facts as written in the appeal claim this. Fred says he wants to engage in sodomy with Leslie. No way, Leslie says. Carolyn is taken aback by the statement. Fred is said to then have used extremely vulgar and foul language directed at Leslie, and both ladies can tell he is getting angrier by the moment, which is where this case gets a bit murky, I'll say. And so I want to just quote here directly from that appeal. Fred and Carolyn then partially disrobed and had been committing sodomy on each other when Fred started getting rough. So it appears that Carolyn decided to oblige Fred by keeping Leslie out of it. But things got weird. As Carolyn and Fred were doing their thing, Fred began to, quote, tear at Carolyn's private parts. Carolyn cries out. Leslie runs over and pushes Fred. Fred gets up and starts to beat and choke Leslie. Carolyn had a weapon in her purse, which she apparently always carried for protection. Leslie knew this, so Leslie ran over, grabbed the gun, and fired one shot at Fred before dropping the weapon. Fred, unfazed by a round coming at him, grabbed his sword and started swinging. This is chaos. Carolyn spotted the pistol, picked it up, and fired the remaining rounds into Fred, hitting and eventually killing him. With Fred on the floor bleeding out, the women panic. They try to clean up all the blood and wipe any fingerprints from the room and the sword, but they just couldn't get it done. When they got outside to leave, the Packard wouldn't start. So they backed Fred's Lincoln up to the door of his office, loaded his body into the back seat, and apparently pushed the Packard with the Lincoln to Leslie's parents' house not far away, that elderly couple where the car was eventually found. Later, Leslie's parents said both Leslie and Carolyn were flustered, had cuts and bruises, and were bleeding when they arrived. "We got into a fight," Leslie explained, when her parents asked what was going on. From there, they left with Fred's body, dumped his clothes in various bins nearby, and then pushed his body into that ditch near his office, set him on fire, and took off out of state. They were ultimately arrested in New York City after someone spotted them, seeing that the entire country was basically on the lookout. Every newspaper covered the story. A June 1962 True Detective magazine headline called the case this: "Texas Murder and the Female Impersonator. Houston cops sought a man who might be wearing a frilly evening gown." So you can see the kind of treatment and exposure the case garnered. Important to note as well, I think, is this was a time when sexual assault and molestation are quite frequently going on in lots of homes. Sad as that sounds. Young girls were terrorized by the males inside their own homes. Carolyn later talks about how she was raped and sexually assaulted many times during her preteen and teen years. In what seems to be all too common a statement, Carolyn later says one particular rape by an 18-year-old boy at a pool party when she was just 12 was so terrifying and extremely painful that she was too frightened and ashamed to tell anyone about it. She says that encounter left deep emotional scars, and she rapidly developed a hatred for all men, which, according to her, led toward her preferring to date women. And just to be clear, I'm quoting from Carolyn's own words there. At 17, she started hanging around the underground gay bars in Houston. Not long after that, she walks into a nightclub and she sees one of Leslie's female impersonation acts, and they strike up a friendship. What is remarkable is how this article I am using as a source is headlined. Quote, "Those sexed up kiss and kill queers" is the title of the piece. And a line from a section talking about how Leslie and Carolyn met actually says, and I quote, "Lesbians and male homosexuals usually get along well together." The ignorance and honestly small-mindedness of the writers then is cringeworthy. But this is how the tabloids exploited people instead of simply reporting the facts as they found them. As a man, Leslie was boyishly handsome, quite quirky, but also elegant, which appealed to Carolyn. I get the impression Carolyn felt safe around Leslie. Carolyn was still in high school at the time, just 17 years old. After meeting Leslie, she quit, enrolled in what was called then beauty school, and they began living together. Carolyn even considered marrying Leslie, and her parents were quite tolerant of the relationship. In that same article, Carolyn says she never had a problem with Leslie bringing men home and accepted that this would be part of their relationship. Because they had very little money, Leslie, the article notes, suggested to Carolyn that she begin working the streets. Carolyn refused. Leslie pleaded, raged, wept, threatened to walk out, to throw Carolyn into the street, and to commit suicide. Quote, "Leslie used every cynical appeal in his hysterical homosexual's bag of emotional tricks on the 17-year-old girl." So what we see here is how the media later blames Leslie, i.e. the homosexual, for bringing Carolyn into a world she knew nothing about, and basically turns Carolyn into a sex worker first, murderer second. It's all put on Leslie. By March 10th, 1961, Leslie and Carolyn are extradited from New York to Texas to face charges. Both plead not guilty and claim self-defense. By May 24th, 1962, after their joint trial, Leslie and Carolyn are found guilty of first-degree capital murder and sentenced to death. Carolyn is set to become the first woman to be executed in Texas in nearly 100 years. Let's take our final break, come back, and explore what are several more twists and incredible, unbelievable turns in this rather remarkable true crime case. I need a favor. Please spread word about our show on social media and word of mouth, of course. And subscribe to Crossing the Line with M. William Phelps wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Don't forget to leave a review of the show, especially on Apple Podcasts. I'm doing this show independently now, free from any corporate or big podcasting media company involvement. And this allows me to bring you more of the content you want to hear and have written in and asked me for. This is completely our show. Reviews and subscriptions truly help. I could not do this show without you. And that support, I must tell you, means everything to me personally. It's incredibly humbling. And I want to thank each of you for listening. I mean this. You have a lot of choices out there, and I'm grateful you've landed on Crossing the Line. We can grow this show together, which will allow me to do even bigger things with it and bring you the content you want. If you go to crossingtheline.biz, mwilliamphelps.com, or look in the show notes, you can contact me to suggest cases or just say hello. Please look for me across all social media platforms at M. William Phelps. That's the @ symbol in my name, M. William Phelps.
Late afternoon in Huntsville, preparations are just about complete for the execution of Leslie Douglas Ashley and Carolyn Lima shortly after midnight tonight. Ashley and Lima are due to die tonight for the torch gun slaying of real estate man Fred Tones 2 years ago in Houston. Meanwhile, their attorneys Lloyd Lunsford and Clyde Woody are filing last-minute appeals in a last-minute effort to stave off the execution. However, thus far, every appeal has been turned down almost immediately. To find out procedures for obtaining a stay and getting that stay to become effective, we'll talk to Assistant Director of the Prison System.
That deadpan report from Mark Helpler standing outside the prison depicts how close Leslie and Carolyn came to being executed. The 50s and 60s were an era when states like Texas wasted little time in executing people after they were sentenced. Leslie and Carolyn are set to be put in the electric chair on March 29, 1963, less than 2 years after Fred Tones' murder. But, as I said at the onset of the episode, just 4 hours before Old Sparky is fired up, a federal judge steps in and stays the executions. Ultimately, the women's stories were believed. They were under the threat of being killed themselves and fought back in self-defense. Within all of the available evidence, I would say that ruling was justified and justice was served. Carolyn is later found guilty of murder without malice and sent to prison to serve what is 10 more months. She was released on April 3rd, 1965. Leslie was declared insane after telling the court she was the return of Elijah the prophet. In doing that, I think Leslie had a plan. She is sent to a medical facility after being found insane, and not long after her admission, Leslie escapes and is back on the run. The FBI puts her on the top 10 list again, and she manages to elude agents for 6 months before being captured in Atlanta, Georgia. And I love this little detail. At the time of her arrest, Leslie is working as Bobo the Clown for a traveling carnival. Leslie gets another trial, found guilty of murder. She's sentenced to 15 years. She is out in 5. 1971, she undergoes gender confirmation surgery. From there, Leslie dedicates her life to gay politics and activism in Houston. She runs for the chair of the Harris County, Texas Democratic Party after taking on the surname Perez, but she loses in 2 runoff elections. After decades of activism, in 1988, Leslie is honored in Houston with Leslie Perez Day by Houston Mayor Catherine Whitmore. She dies in July 2005. And I found this. In April 1966, a film is released, a cheaply made B or even C movie for sure. The title is Burn, Baby, Burn. It sensationalized Carolyn's story to the max, claiming as its logline, if they didn't pay for play, she would burn them alive. The picture on the poster is of a very large-breasted woman, her unbuttoned shirt barely covering her, with 2 blowtorches in her hands. And I bet there are plenty of people who believe true crime is over the top today. One small report I found declared that Carolyn, during her second trial, testified that Leslie shot Fred, quote, in cold blood and burned his body herself, without Carolyn having had anything to do with it. She also said Leslie threatened to kill her if she didn't share in the blame. But during her first trial, Carolyn said she and Leslie participated together and that she actually flicked the match that burned Fred up. I'm not sure we really know what happened inside Fred's office beyond him being murdered and, I think, attacking those women. I have read reports claiming that Leslie could act in a very peculiar way at times and controlled Carolyn, and actually was, in fact, partially insane. So who knows? Carolyn never contacted Leslie again. That much is for certain. And she actually disappears off the map after she gets out of prison. What an incredibly surreal true crime case, if there ever was one. That's going to do it for this week. Please get over to patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps and sign up for my free content page, where I'll be interacting with you, doing live streams, posting exclusive content, sending out newsletters, and dropping a major limited series podcast exclusively for Patreon members later this year. That's patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. Sources for this episode include Leslie Douglas Ashley and Carolyn Lima versus the state of Texas, 1963. Beatnik Killers, True Crime Tales. Judge issues delay of execution, The Daily Telegram, March 30th, 1963. Leslie Perez, formerly Leslie Douglas Ashley, killer transsexual or controversial activist. Houston, LGBT history. I am not leaving out the Q, that is how it is sourced. The audio is from the Houston LGBT History Archive. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinus, Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Music by Epidemic Sound. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.